Um, John Bew is a professor in history and foreign policy at King's College London. He held the Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress. But for the last 5 years, he has been the foreign policy advisor for 4 prime ministers, the advisor most proximate to the prime minister. John, history's in the blood for you, isn't it? Did you have much choice about being a professor? You know, both your father, Paul Bew, and your mother, Greta Jones, were both professors. Did you have much say in the matter?
I guess in hindsight, there was probably some path dependency that I didn't quite recognize at the time. It was more of a challenge of not being good at anything else, Andrew. That meant I sort of ended up entering academia. It certainly was not my dream, but it's something that happened. Sort of death by a thousand cuts thereafter. But basically a reflection of my incompetence in any other walk of life.
Do you know, that's exactly why I'm a historian as well. I was functionally enumerate when I was in the city, and therefore I chucked it. Let's talk about your books. Castlereagh, which was published in 2011, about the great British foreign minister of the Napoleonic Wars, an absolute giant, not well known now, sadly, not as well known as his contemporaries, people like Talleyrand and Metternich, but he should be, shouldn't he?
Absolutely, absolutely. I was reflecting before we came to this podcast, Andrew, that an unkind interpretation of my books would be that I do the B-sides for your A-sides, in the sense that you've written on Wellington, I've written on Castlereagh, you've written on Churchill, I've written on Attlee. But actually, of course, I'd of course say they're the A-sides, and Castlereagh is an A-side figure. So, among others, he was very much admired by Henry Kissinger. And in fact, at different periods of history, crucial periods like the 1930s, there was a big famous biography of Castlereagh as well, as Britain tried to navigate the foreign policy challenges of that era. So Castlereagh, for those who are interested in major questions of international order, statecraft, how you navigate questions of values and enlightenment in a world that does not follow Enlightenment rules, is actually kind of extremely useful. I was attracted to him partly because he's an Ulsterman by birth, like myself, born not far from where I was. But actually, his career thereafter is of huge consequence. He's British Foreign Secretary for 10 years, from 1812 to 1822. Before that, he was Chief Secretary in Ireland in a period of rebellion. He was intimately involved in the Act of Union in 1801. He was War Secretary, and of course, he was the great sponsor of the Duke of Wellington. And without Castlereagh's sponsoring, backing, and support, you wouldn't have had the sort of path to Waterloo and the eventual success in the Napoleonic Wars.
And he kept the anti-Napoleon coalition together for years and years.
Absolutely. So it takes 6 coalitions to defeat Napoleon, and the only country on that's consistently in the anti-Napoleon coalition is Britain. But Britain can't fight a land war to defeat Napoleon, so therefore Britain has to deliver a grand strategy that involves proxy war, guerrilla war in the peninsula, maritime challenge to France, but basically also a sort of diplomatic masterclass of building these coalitions simultaneously. And he's truly a kind of a grand strategic figure in that sense, Castlereagh.
Which brings us on to Realpolitik, the subject of your 2015 book. You were, as I mentioned, the Kissinger Chair at Library of Congress, and you knew Henry well. And of course, he is considered today the great master of modern Realpolitik. How did his foreign policy making actually stack up when it came to Realpolitik? Was it a sort of cold-blooded policy of Realpolitik, or was there an element of idealism there as well? Or should one not see this as two sort of poles of the same thing?
We shouldn't see it as 2 poles, but I got to know Henry through the shared interest in Lord Castlereagh. So Castlereagh is the hero with Metternich of A World Restored, so his graduate thesis book. Also, in the last few years of his life, I had the pleasure to organise the publication of Henry's undergraduate thesis on a meaning of history, Spengler and Toynbee and Kant. And this absolutely supports Neil Ferguson's argument in his first volume on Henry, which he calls idealist, because Henry is someone wrestling with the same question that Castro is wrestling with in the sort of peak Enlightenment era for Castro, which is how do you preserve a sense of enlightenment and a certain set of values, and also order, because in Castlereagh's view, order is a thing that allows enlightenment and radical revolutionary change is something that upsets him and scares him. But how do you do that in a world where great power politics is happening, where ethnic identity, national identity, confessional identity is also everywhere, so a more sort of Hobbesian world. And it's that sort of balance that you allude to, not two poles, but a balance between trying to keep a sort of civilizational goal and then the sort of challenges of acting in a realist way alive. Now, realpolitik is a kind of different kind of word. And Henry, I think, says himself at one stage, I think his speech in London in the early 1980s, that the exponents of a realist foreign policy are caricatured by the German word realpolitik. And he kind of thought that in some ways, because of his German background, it was sort of thrown at him as an allegation, as something sort of imported from the dark heart of Europe into Anglo-American foreign policy. And of course, there's never been people have sort of very rarely sort of worn the badge of realpolitik in a kind of favorable
It's considered
fashion.
Machiavellian.
It's considered Machiavellian. So I kind of went back to the original. I said, well, what is this word that Henry says he's been caricatured with? And I discovered the original text, which is a book in 1853 by a German liberal revolutionary, actually, who basically fails in 1833 and fails again in 1848 to deliver a liberal revolution across Europe, and travels from Germany to Paris to Italy as he sees the dreams of the 1848ers go up in smoke. Of course, by the way, Karl Marx is doing the same thing. So all these people who think the world is going to change in 1848 and it doesn't change in the way they're expecting are trying to wrestling with this. So this is where the word realpolitik was born. So it's created by a liberal saying, okay, I want constitutionalism, I want enlightened government, I want a sensible government by the people. I want people to have rights. So Ludwig von Rocow, for example, was very progressive on the rights of Jews in Germany. But I've got to work out how to achieve those goals, because around me, I'm faced by external threat. I'm faced by other social forces. I'm faced by traditionalism, conservatism of the church in some instances. So I've got to navigate that world. So realpolitik is actually, in its original inception, about, I say, it's a kind of a liberal end state or a goal, but basically it's a kind of, to borrow a phrase from another time, von Rocow and the creator of realpolitik is a liberal mugged by reality. So he's basically trying to work out how I navigate politics, how I accept that power politics is a natural fact of life, and how to deliver politics on the back of it.
Following up on the concept of external threat, the person, of course, who worked very hard in the 1940s, late 1940s in particular, to end external threat, or at least deal with external threat to Britain, was Clement Attlee, the subject of your 2016 book, Citizen Clem. That extraordinary concatenation of alliances, NATO, of course, being the central one, but lots of others that essentially help make Britain safe. Tell us about and preserve the peace. Tell us about that book. What made you want to write it, and what would you say its main thesis is?
Well, I was trying to pick a 20th century British Prime Minister who you haven't written about, Andrew. So I went for Clement Attlee. But, I mean, I deeply admired. I like a certain type of character. So I like Castlereagh because he was not a wonderful speaker. He's from the provinces in terms of how he's regarded by rivals like Canning, who are extremely lucid and quick on their feet. But he had a sort of deep soulfulness to him and a seriousness, and that kind of appealed to me at some levels as a Northern Irishman. That's a very flattering portrait of a Northern Irishman, by the way, but I'll stick with it. Attlee, the things that academics have missed about Attlee are really interesting to me. It's a deep patriotism, which is kind of, particularly as a figure on the left, is sort of less interesting to a lot of scholars who've written about Attlee. And then a kind of unobtrusive sophistication. So he read a hell of a lot, but he read widely. He read Kipling. He read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire as the British Empire in India was ending, and he didn't wear that kind of reading on his sleeve. So patriotism, history. He wonderfully describes Churchill as a kind of layer cake of different centuries. He says he has a 16th century, a 17th century, an 18th century, 19th century, and just about a 20th century layer. So he has that sense of history, he has that sense of patriotism, and a kind of but a sort of simple clipped tone. So for him, politics is sort of efficiency. It's municipal boards. It's that, but a sort of deepness to him, a seriousness to him, and also of course he loved Churchill. So they have this odd
Well,
relationship.
he
but
was
you know
one of the
yourself.
few people who didn't blame Churchill for Gallipoli, and he was the last man off the beaches, essentially, wasn't he, in January 1916, and had been very brave in Gallipoli, but didn't think he thought that it could have come off, and it actually strategically was not a bad idea. Is
No,
that
completely
fair?
right. He blamed the generals and he blamed the logistics, and he thought it was the right strategic conception from Churchill, poorly delivered upon by the sort of upper echelons. So he was Major Attlee in the First World War. He has a bit of a dad's army, First World War. So he's carried off the battlefield 3 times. The first time is at Gallipoli through dysentery, and he goes back to Gallipoli, and as you say, he's the last man off the beach. He's desperate to get out with his men. Then in Mesopotamia, he's actually hit by artillery shell and has his back and buttock quite badly damaged by friendly fire. And then finally, he's hit by a falling log on the Western Front in 1918. But brave, deeply patriotic, and crucially, and here's the difference: 2 journeys of the British left in the early 20th century. He falls out with his brother very badly. His brother's a pacifist. His brother actually goes to prison very nearby the Attlee family home for his pacifism, and Attlee views his brother's politics as anarchic individualism. For Attlee, citizenship is rights, but also responsibilities to the state and the nation. So deep patriotism, admiration for Churchill. And it's very hard to see who could have been deputy prime minister to Churchill. Very hard to see who could beat Churchill in 1945 in such a peaceful fashion, to be honest with you. There's a kind of remarkable story between the 2 of them.
Didn't just beat him, thrashed him, didn't he? I mean, it was one of the great landslides of modern history. Um, so you've written these three extremely well received books, and what then gets you into number 10, 3 years after Citizen Clem's published?
So, but partly through the Kissinger chair and partly through coming from an academic but highly political family. So my dad was intimately involved in the Good Friday Agreement and was an advisor to David Trimble.
It's
And
also worth pointing out that he's the most respected member of the House of Lords on Irish history as well.
the second most respected after you in general. I had a sort of political family. And then I was doing quite a lot of writing on foreign affairs. I was also a specialist in the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, which is a kind of as a sort of bipartisan academic expert. So I was sort of involved in a sort of political world. But really, I was minding my business, my own business in King's College London, when a colleague of mine there, Munira Mirza, who was to be the head of the policy unit, sort of stopped me in the corridor and said, do you want to come into government in 2019 in remarkable tricky circumstances? So if you remember, Boris Johnson was replacing Theresa May, but had an effective sort of minus majority. I wasn't sort of particularly party political or partisan, and I said no for 2 weeks, and then finally I wilted and did it. And best decision I ever made professionally. It's very hard to say no to these things, and but it's been a remarkable and a privilege to be involved.
What was it like working for Boris?
So I worked for him for 3 years, and we worked together intimately. I worked extremely closely with him on issues like Ukraine, and it was during the Ukraine period inspirational to work with him. It was a real privilege.
Can you
And
remember
I
where you were on the 22nd of February? Sorry, the 24th of February, 2022.
Yeah, I remember vividly. So the military assistant called up Boris. I think Boris writes about it in his book, or said this. So it's obviously something we expected pretty imminently, that the invasion would start. But the military assistant called me first before he called the prime minister and said this is going to happen now. So yeah, I remember it. So it was at home,
Why?
but
Why
sort
did he
of
call you before the prime
to
minister?
make sure that sort of the team that were going to respond and be there for the prime minister were sort of well set. To be able to sort of click into gear. We had a very close working relationship. So I remember it very, very vividly.
And he must have. I mean, you must have been game planning the what you were going to be doing anyhow, considering that the intelligence services had said this was going to happen.
So we'd done a lot of sort of diplomatic travel. We'd had a series of calls between the Prime Minister and President Putin, actually, before Christmas. From memory, I remember one vividly from the Prime Minister's parliamentary office. So yes, we had
Or
been.
just warning him not to do it.
We were all sort of international leaders were hitting the phones, basically sort of, recognizing the build up, sort of teasing out the position. Actually, the visit I remember as I traveled with the Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, to Moscow, I think just almost only a week before the war. As Secretary of Defense, Ben Wallace met his opposite numbers, Shoigu and Gerasimov in the Russian Ministry of Defense. So I remember that sort of vividly.
What are they? What are they like, Shoigu and Gerasimov?
I mean, granite-like.
As you'd expect.
As you'd expect. It was the atmosphere was sort of crackling, and there was so much sort of noise about what might happen. We also travelled to the Munich Security Conference where Boris Johnson made a speech there. We met other international leaders. So the truth is we were sort of all gearing up internationally and working out how to respond, in what format, in what group, but it was a pretty unprecedented situation. There's no obvious copybook for it. And I think the UK did respond very well.
Oh,
ultimately.
yes. No, absolutely. But in the first few hours, were you worried that Kyiv might fall?
So there was a sort of lively debate about what would happen if the invasion went ahead. And actually, one of the roles I was able to play sometimes in government, and there's always openness to this, by the way, and sometimes academics outside get very frustrated that government's not listening. Actually, there's real appetite for external expertise, particularly in the era we are in right now, whereby the kaleidoscope has been shaken, to borrow a phrase from another prime minister, when some of our assumptions about the world are uncertain, and where there's so much complexity, you need to reach for that external expertise. The state can't do it. So I organised something which Boris talks about in his book, and there's a subject of a Twitter discussion the other day, a seminar with a group of experts. Because we had our assessments, but also that didn't quite tell you. Intelligence assessments tell you so much about what's going on, about intent, about trajectory, all those different types of things. I think, the Prime Minister was pretty clear himself, having travelled around Ukraine a lot and having had a feel for the place. His strong view was that Ukraine would fight, and Ukraine had a stronger sort of sense of nationhood than was being presumed in Moscow. So I think he was sort of confident in that. We also travelled to Kyiv just a few days, I think just a couple of weeks before the war as well, and saw Zelensky there. So his view. So we'd have assessments, but his view was sort of partly based on history, partly based on sort of instincts that came from history. He's a biographer of Churchill as well, and unquestionably that's all in the swirl. And we did think of historical
And there was a
episodes
personal chemistry between Boris and Zelensky as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, and it went back some way. I remember a meeting in the UN General Assembly, I think 2020 or maybe in 2019, in which there was a kind of, they found each other sort of, interesting as sort of political figures. So that there was definitely a rapport there that pre-existed, yeah.
And Britain actually was the first to do lots of things, wasn't it? To send lethal equipment, to then send more and more bigger equipment, and he was the first head of government to visit Kyiv after the invasion. I mean, we were in a sense leading the way, weren't we?
Yeah, it felt like that. I mean, so the maybe the slightly boring answer, but it's the truthful answer, is that it is always better to act in concert. And the real story, I think, there's a number of big stories about the response to Ukraine, is actually sort of what you might call Allied unity or Western unity held up far better than a lot of people predicted. And if you think of the extent of US support, it's vast and dwarfs anything the UK did in terms of size and commitment. So that sort of unity did actually hold up well, and people were presuming it would sort of collapse. It still holds up pretty well, by the way. And every year someone says, "Oh, it's getting weaker and weaker." That was not our lived experience. But then there was a series of debates around certain capabilities, and defensive equipment was the big one, or lethal aid, as it was called. We were very cautious about our language, about the decision-making process around that as well. But that was actually in the lead up to the invasion. So it was before the invasion when there was a debate about NLAWs, the anti tank weapons, and then after the invasion, a series of other debates about whether or not we should send tanks, our own tanks, whether or not we should train pilots or send our own aircraft, etc. So it's a succession of debates, and each of those, yes, the UK was sort of on the.
And what about the latest, actually allowing Ukrainians to use missiles within Russia?
I thought you'd go there. Mercifully, I've been out of government for long enough to sort of recuse myself from getting into that. But I think what that belies, well, alongside the individual capability decisions, there's got to be a sort of broader strategic approach, which involves a lot of different dimensions. So helping Ukraine broad, in terms of broad financial stability.
And you're still doing that here at Hoover. You're interested in how to unfreeze those Russian assets and help Ukraine with Russia's money.
Yes, so I'm working here on a project on urgent security choices, which is kind of a 6-12 month time frame, which is an argument for sort of brain power. And by the way, there's plenty of people, particularly in the national security state, and I made sure to say this. I was leaving government with a letter I sent to everyone to say thank you. And there's highly, highly capable, thoughtful, impressive people on these national security subjects. But we are in an era where we can always do with more thinking, more analysis, more reflection, and we're at another inflection point because of the US presidential election as well. So into 2025, the question we're asking ourselves is what can be a sort of a durable strategy for Ukraine that adapts to the new realities, but puts Ukraine in the best possible position. And again, there's openness to hear more about that.
And when President Trump says he can solve the war in an afternoon, presumably that isn't the way that the British foreign office is looking at things either.
I mean, lots of things are said in presidential elections, right?
He's been saying it since long before this election. John.
I mean, this stuff is complicated. That's the only thing I'd say, right? So it requires sort of a multifaceted approach. I go back to what I said about Castlereagh. The achievement of Castlereagh is to mobilize the British Army, mobilize a coalition, think about the peace that follows the war as well. And the whole way through the Napoleonic Wars, as you well know, British ministers are trying to implement a peace plan that's really kind of hatched by the late 1790s, right? So to think about all these things in concert is absolutely vital. So there's no sort of diplomatic switch or military switch that solves these sort of complex problems. So all ideas welcome, but the complexity is enduring and unavoidable.
Keeping alliances together was also quite key to your integrated review, the one that people, the sort of big picture is that we were going to tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. Was it the way in which AUKUS started to become a real thing? Tell us about AUKUS and about the review and the way in which it was intended to and did indeed keep alliances fresh and active.
So I was involved in 2 reviews. I never quite say I was the pen holder because these things are done by ministers and agreed by ministers with lots of different departmental inputs. It also means I can recuse myself from anything I don't agree with. So we did sort of two processes, both of which led to increases in defence spending. We can have a debate about whether that's enough, and you won't be surprised to think to hear I'm on the side of increased defence spending. Both of them did lead to significant increases in defence spending. One was under Boris Johnson in 2021. The other was the refresh of the review, reflecting the fact that the international environment had got worse in 2023. So the 2021 review was basically the sort of first big post-Brexit review. It actually published, it coincided with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, so the Brexit deal. which meant it was sort of self-denying in some areas, which were sort of part of negotiations or cut from negotiations. Like all these things, Andrew, we're historians. Everything is a product of time and place and discourse and language and different types of political leadership. So there's no sort of eternal truth to be uncovered in a national security strategy. Also, we were very clear while we said we need to be more involved in the Indo-Pacific. The document is extremely clear-eyed about the Russia threat. In a way, actually, we were sort of criticized for being too hawkish on the Russia portfolio. So it says in 2021 that Russia is the most acute threat to the UK and its security. And it says, therefore, the priority should be Euro-Atlantic security through NATO. So one of the things we were doing through Brexit is sort of constantly emphasizing renewing our NATO vows. And as I was writing that document, I was also part of the NATO Secretary General's reflections group. So we were also simultaneously working on the sort of new NATO strategic concept. So those are supposed to be synchronized. Sometimes there's a presentation, often by former Mandarin or in the FT. This is a kind of a big huffy lurch to the Indo-Pacific, Brexit Britain. It's actually much more nuanced than that if you read the text. And then on AUKUS particularly, so there's a couple of examples of where we sort of
Tell us
tried
about
to
AUKUS and also the Quad and the way in which the sort of ideas for a NATO down in the Southeast Asia.
So the way we sort of approach this as well is to say, look, we're renewing our marriage vows on the kind of fundamental key relationships. Strong investment in the US-led alliance system, no hedging from the UK. Sometimes US partners seem to hedge on these big questions. So the document's also known for being more robust or a shift of tone on, for example, the China challenge. Now, the second thing we said is, and also NATO is an example of that, but we need to be far more dynamic and imaginative and creative about the types of alliances we were able to create or partnerships we're able to create. And there's a number of examples of that. So one is what we did with lethal aid to Ukraine and other things, which is the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is the UK and 9 other Nordic, Baltic nations. And what we did with that is to sort of turn it into a leaders summit, use it as a kind of mobilization of support for Ukraine. Those are the countries that, in the European context, are broadly speaking the more robust on the challenges of that. And we did work on undersea cables, maritime security, energy security, et cetera, et cetera. So we lit that up. There's other examples as well. The other example is AUKUS, which basically is the best encapsulation of what we were trying to do with our national securities, which is to invest in defense, invest in the capabilities of the future, reimagine our alliances and partnerships, engage in deterrence. And the whole point about AUKUS is it provides that deterrence, get ahead technologically. So that was all done in sort of immense secrecy, but it's a kind of, a real sort of proud moment in government to be involved in that. And that will endure in different years. So there's two sort of prime examples of how we engage in these questions. And for the UK, we think it important that we maintain that global perspective. And sometimes that's seen as grandiose or vainglorious. To my mind, it's absolutely crucial to recognize where our partners and allies, including successful and important partners and allies who have things you want to be part of, like good education systems, technological development. Let's think of our close relationships with the Republic of Korea or Japan, which have never been stronger than they are at the moment. That's all part of the picture. That does not to run away from Europe at all. That's a complete misconception of that as well. We've managed to reset a lot of our European relationships. So all those things together, is in a world where the West and the G7 has declining share of global GDP, you had to reach out to new partners and allies. You had to rethink and deepen some of your partnerships. And I think we've done a kind of relatively successful job of that, even as the world gets more challenging and forbidding.
The new government is bringing out a new strategic review. How's that going to be different from what you did?
So actually, I was a little bit involved with the launch of this review, and there's some excellent people on it. So General Richard Barrons, George Robertson,
who's been on the show, in fact, George Robertson.
Okay. Yeah. So the former Secretary General of NATO and a former Labour Defence Minister, and Fiona Hill, the UK-born, but someone who served in a number of US administrations in the national security space as well. 3 people I admire and rate very highly. So I'm very supportive of what they're trying to do. It's a slightly different exercise, Andrew, in the sense that this is a defence review. So it's not sort of litigating or relitigating the sort of broader strategic posture. And, the reviewers are very clear, for example, on things like AUKUS, they're deeply invested, and things like NATO, they're deeply invested. So it's a reflection of the fact, and all our allies and partners are going through this, that there's anxiety about defense modernization, the relative balance of forces, size of the army is one of the big debates as well, the capabilities that we have, what we deliver to NATO. And also, I think crucially, the most dynamic and interesting area is defense industrial, the defense industrial base and defense industrial production, because none of our NATO defense industrial bases are in sufficiently ripe or strong conditions to sort of, at the moment to face the types of challenges we think we might be facing. So I kind of welcome and support it. I think it'll report over the course of the year. A lot of it will come down to the money, as they say, and it always does. But the reviewers are all on the right track, and they recognise and are very supportive of the things we have done, such as strong support for Ukraine, such as AUKUS. So I welcome it. And you know what's happened in British politics as well, Andrew? There's been a return to a kind of a broadly speaking bipartisan consensus on most of the fundamental security issues. I think that's good for the country, right? That's something quite unique to Britain since 1945. It's the Attlee-Churchill logic. Of course, there's big debates over certain interventions, or in Attlee and Churchill case over India. Today's case, there's obviously debates. But
Well,
sort of
like
the fundamentals.
giving the Chagos Islands.
I knew you were going to go to that. Yeah.
Giving them back to Mauritius. That's not bipartisan, is it?
No, it's been quite a flawed issue. But if you compare it to sort of the big sort of structural things on the sort of fundamentals like support for Ukraine, on belief in the alliance system, those are kind of, compared to a lot of countries, there's a strong bipartisan consensus. That there's always, history will always punch you in the face with thorny and unexpected challenging issues. I'm definitely not getting sucked into that Chagos debate.
COVID, you were there in place in this job when COVID hit. How did that affect global politics?
Yeah, I mean, in ways that we were all sort of gaming this, and the kind of one of the interesting things about COVID is it was a rare period in government where the sort of the particularly in the foreign affairs space, the sort of pattern of business was so disrupted. So the usual bilaterals or summits. I remember doing a NATO summit from the cabinet room. Amusingly, by the way, when someone's always got to sit in the chair, and when the Prime Minister went to the bathroom in the midst of this in the cabinet room, I for one moment was the UK's representative at NATO with these other international international. I was a head of government for a short and glorious period of time.
I hope he wasn't away for long.
I almost tempted to lock the door and announce a coup. But because of that, we sort of did some deep thinking. It does strike me, and I've made a pitch to you at the start of this podcast for sort of thinking and dealing with complexity. But sometimes thinking, isn't particularly enlightening, right? So we all had a set of predictions about how the world would change after COVID or the way things would go. Do you remember, for example, there was a period in which everyone said the authoritarian states were far better at dealing with this? This was the kind of de rigueur idea, and that was certainly an anxiety. Or the things that we went after at the start. I mean, there was vaccine diplomacy, but there's also a real battle for ventilators as well, which turned out to be less useful in the kind of fight for COVID, and sort of allies and partners, almost having punches up on runways, getting this kit as well. So it was so unprecedented that we sort of scrambled for a whole set of answers. But it was a kind of period of reflection and thinking as well, because you're out of this period. I don't think sort of there's any sort of massive insights to come out of it, to be honest with you. I mean, I think there's probably two enduring nagging lessons. The first is that there are things that nation states have to do for themselves, because when it comes to the crunch, international cooperation can get very fraught and limited when it comes to the survival of your citizens. So, there's sovereign capabilities you need. And then the second is, if you can't kind of hoard or have all those sovereign capabilities, you've got to make damn sure you have your place in the supply chain, or that you provide something of use to others to trade and deliver. So there's something, both the sort of narrow national lesson, which is get your act together very quickly, but a second one, recognizing there are no simple nation state answers to problems. You've got to be able to react very quickly and offer something to partners and allies in a multilateral space. So those two things, and that's the kind of, to my mind, the big foreign policy lesson, that duality of those two things, because the market wasn't going to deliver everything you needed at that moment in time.
Was it a pain that we weren't able to find out exactly how it started early enough?
Yeah, I mean, but also, probably in government, the focus was so much on the response that people sort of kick the question on origins a little bit down to the into the future as well, and without any kind of obvious, immediate, clear answer, many theories and lots of analysis. It seemed better to focus our energies on making sure we responded so quickly, because it was a fraught and a highly difficult period.
Which brings us on to the blood sugar theory of history. What's that?
Yeah, no. So just a reflection, Andrew. So there's, we talked a little bit before we came on the podcast about statecraft, and I said to you one of the great things about statecraft. So I think it's a brilliant word for government. Our books. What do we write about? We write about statecraft, right? So we write about literally the craft of politics, the art of success, and we write about how individuals or groups of individuals or nations try and either navigate historical forces or channel historical forces.
And you said that you didn't think that AI was going to be able to muscle in on this area.
No, I think that's prudence and wisdom, right? If AI can do prudence and wisdom, I was talking to someone yesterday.
It clearly can't.
Maybe it can one day. I imagine that there's going to be a hologram of Churchill. We can ask questions like, would you have been pro the Brexit position,
I already know the answer to that.
We know this is a live debate. Maybe there are two forms of AI as well. There's a version of that. But, so, prudence, wisdom, historical reasoning, I think that's quite hard to teach. And my confirmation bias is that those are really valuable things in government. And it brings, sometimes you feel helpless in the face of historical forces. Sometimes through sort of banging your head against the wall or different forms of leadership, you can kind of change the course of history. So I think, again, the UK's position on Ukraine, I think I'd had a genuinely galvanizing effect for a lot of circumstances. And then there's just the strong human element to it, and it's particularly visible in Number 10. There's periodic attempts to move people out of Number 10 to sort of conference centre, much more sort of modern office space attempts. Every time they do it, they people rush back in within a couple of weeks as well. There's a tide goes out and the tide comes back in. Because the truth is, in politics, the human element, proximity, conversations that the Americans would say water cooler. I'm not sure our equivalent.
Cup of tea.
Cup of tea. Those conversations actually really matter, and also the human element, literally the sort of the time of day in which decisions are made. I'm really struck by that as well. So politicians get tired. They're sort of kicked around a bit on travel. The demand on a prime minister is immense. The physical demand, the broad subject matter expert. So it leads me to kind of my sort of blood sugar theory of history. You can see when a prime minister is tired, or a foreign secretary is tired, or a leader of another country. I can think of a number. I don't want to name them without causing a diplomatic incident. Because their body clock is out, they're stressed, there's anxiety, and that affects decision making. Sometimes it improves decision making, gives you a sharpness and a clarity, and lets you reduce the thing. So I'd love to sort of hook people up and do this. There's things people stick in their arms now for managed nutrition. There's future historians will stick some sort of probe into future prime ministers and chart their decision-making patterns against levels of blood sugar as well. So it's a simple way of saying that the art of politics is still an art with a strong human dimension to it.
Physical closeness is important, but how much did that irritate the Foreign Office, which is, of course, across the street? Did any of them say, who is this whippersnapper who's much younger than us, who hasn't been in the foreign policy decision-making arena, and yet he's got the ear of the Prime Minister, whereas I'm the permanent Undersecretary, and it should be me?
That's a great question. So I'm pausing as I think about it. Look, everyone's incredibly nice. The advantage of Number 10 is that, by and large, people are nice and respectful and open. And I'll repeat it. Our sort of broad national security, diplomatic, military state. I'm like Clement Attlee, a plodding patriot, and it is the privilege of my life to work with the people I've worked with across the piece, and the professionalism and the excellence. Maybe I'm comparing to academia. That's the problem. It is very impressive. So I have nothing but a kind of experience, positive experience of that. I also think, there's something if you're in our building and government, both people sort of want direction and they want leadership, and then they're remarkably adaptive and respond to it very, very well. So what we did on Ukraine across the agencies, arms of states, never felt there was a huge fraughtness across this. Obviously, there was debates about critical issues. So So my sort of broad experience is very good. Not an easy period against the backdrop of Brexit and those different types of things. I guess the sort of more frustrating thing after, and I will, and I made a vow not to do it myself, is that sometimes you turn on the radio in the morning. It's just kind of shoving a bowl of cereal down your face and you're trying to get your kids out for school, and you hear sort of former senior figures, often on the Today program in the morning, being sort of rather pious and properist about the complexities of politics. That was a kind of recurring frustration. But those in it are by and large, to borrow an
So you're
awfully
not going to
jarred
do
phrase.
that. You're not going to
Well,
be nudging your
I said I wouldn't
successors,
do it, but
elbow.
I've had a couple of questions, a couple of interviews about it. But yeah, and it's not, so it's, it is always deeply complicated, and when you're in there, and you're always, it's always half measures, it's always complicated. So you can, people do get sensitive to that as well. But broad experiences, the state pulls together as a coherence. And
Is there
again,
anything-
from externally, I think that sort of the view of the British national security state diplomatic services, military
Intelligence,
agencies
of course.
actually is pretty good around the world, right? And we live in a democracy and people respond to their ministers. So it would be grouchy for me to grumble. Obviously,
So
if you ask
there's
someone at the Foreign
nothing
Office, they may feel different.
major that you would change about the structure of how the UK conducts its foreign policy decision making.
So there's small things I do, absolutely. So I think because there's now an increased openness to external expertise and knowledge, I would, but there's not often incentives to do that. So there's a couple of small things I do that I think would help. Here's one. I would institute a mandatory reading week, or maybe 2 mandatory reading weeks for sort of mid-career national security officials, because the problem of not being mandatory is that if they had that week, they would sort of collapse at the end of the week and want to, go to the gym and spend some time with their family if they weren't required in the office. But you can do this sort of structural reading. I think people would be up for that. There's got to be an incentivization to learn more.
Apart from our books,
and know
what else
more.
would you make? What
Only
else
our
would you-
books.
Yeah.
That would be no. So here's another point. The return of the essay is another feature of what I've seen in government. Right, making sense about the world. So there's too much. Sometimes government tries to mimic political science fashions. So you have acronyms for sort of concepts that sort of end up being sort of, after a while, unserious. The famous one is always the rules-based international system, which is a thing in a certain form. As soon as people started calling it Orbis, I was thinking of some sort of rare bird meandering around, and they sort of take the joy out of it. Or, in the period of counterinsurgency, there was a sort of political science infiltrated. And now history is back, and history is in our face, and the complexity of history and the way nations rise and fall. So more history, less pol-sci. Would be my pitch. But there are things you can do in that sense. And then there's a balance between generalism and expertise. So I think, in certain senior levels, to be credible, I'm struck always when I go to the US and I've got many close friends in around administration or potential different future administrations of different stripes. There's a premium on sort of deep expertise, on subject matter expertise. And I think there's a balance between competent generalism, which is a good attribute of the UK civil service, and then sometimes, expertise as well. So sometimes the incentive structurally in Whitehall or around how many people you manage, or what your scores are in terms of HR, happiness, and then all these things are matter. Morale matters, work culture matters, but I mean, to my mind, expertise and knowledge has to be the most important thing, and I'd sort of just try and elevate that up a little bit.
You mentioned rise and fall of empires. In some of our adversaries, I'm thinking in particular of China and Iran, they both believe that the West is declining and that their time is coming. How can we either dissuade them of that, or how can we prevent it from happening, if it is happening?
So first thing to say is I think it an important insight, probably the most important insight from the life and career of Henry Kissinger. If you think about world order or world restored, or that undergraduate thesis, The Meaning of History, it's basically you've got to understand how the others think of their place in the world, how they think of their own civilization, how they think about the trajectory of their civilization, the clock on which they operate is often different than others as well. I think that's really important for China. You mentioned Iran as well, so the sort of backdrop of sort of Persian culture. Understanding Russia and Russia's current position is not simply about sort of its legitimate or illegitimate security concerns. There's something else driving it. There's history essays that Putin's written, and Ben Wallace famously responded to, critiquing some of the ideas. So history again really matters in that process. How can we respond to it? Obvious example is reaffirming and strengthening and deepening our alliances. So I think that whole linkage between the economic security or economic relationships or educative relationships or technological relationships, the depth, that's the whole point about AUKUS, right? The depth of the alliance is really important. So deepen the alliances, strengthen the alliances. But again, the answer to the West is declining. It's a complicated one. It's an issue, right? So if you'd taken the time, I first went into government more than 5.5 years ago, the sort of simple narrative was China rise, US decline, and there was a kind of a cottage industry in picking the year in which China would overtake the US economically over that period of time. And then COVID comes, and everyone says Western chaos, authoritarian genius over this period of time. That's been blown up by primarily by US growth. The US has sort of bounced back in terms of overall sort of economic strength. The challenge, I think, in the West more broadly is that same picture doesn't apply to the other G7 countries. So the G7 share of global GDP is going down. The US share is pretty strong and probably even going up in some respects. So I think there's a broader allied question about how you sort of, get growth going again, make sure that US partners need to make sure for themselves are at the forefront of critical and emerging tools of national power and also the future economy. And here's why we've got to get, much as you and I, Andrew, may be kicking and screaming about AI going too far, we've got to be, really at the forefront of things like that as well. So it's competitiveness as well as robustness. And in the strategic challenge, the big one is to be able to restore deterrence, not to return to a land where we all understand each other better, but basically that would be nice if it happens. And understanding is crucial in international politics, but be able to deter against people who are trying to rip up the system or challenge and threat.
How important is history in understanding China's attitude towards Taiwan?
Vital, isn't it? I mean, it's a part of the national story, but in two ways. The first way is the history of one China and the history of the story of the Chinese Communist Party and broader Chinese civilization. The second is on the question of whatever happens thereafter. Everyone, when thinking about the Taiwan question and potential contingencies, is thinking through the lens of history, both recent, Russia, Ukraine, the failure of deterrence there, or arguably in some respects the holding of deterrence in other ways. Everyone's thinking about those lessons of history. So both in terms of the sense of civilizational purpose and mission. The second is the sort of lessons of history, again, in which blood sugar comes in, but again, by the way, right? The ups and downs, domestic politics, that sort of complex picture. So there's no easy answer to these questions, to state the bleeding obvious.
If Russia seemed to have won in Ukraine, would that increase the danger to Taiwan?
I think that's a view you hear in a lot of capitals, and interestingly, you hear them in a lot of capitals in places like the Indo-Pacific. It's something that Europeans say and are fond of saying, those particularly on the side of US, we need your continuing support on the Ukraine portfolio. It's something Europeans say in Washington. But I'm really struck on recent travels and discussions just how much you hear it in the Indo-Pacific for people who are sort of, the situation is more consequential and immediate in terms of the challenge there.
Moving on to the Middle East, Sinwar died yesterday, and day before yesterday, but we all knew about it yesterday. Do you think this might be a new departure?
So I was reading overnight what Netanyahu said in response, which was, I think it was something like this, a significant moment in the beginning of the end of the war. I think there's probably a scenario a number of months ago where the removal of Sinwar from the scene may have led to sort of more abrupt end. I think the situation is different and more dynamic, and it's different and more dynamic because of the success that the Israelis have had, particularly in dealing with Iranian proxy groups and primarily Hezbollah as well. So the situation is different than previously. But the initial Netanyahu response is something significant here. But again, some of the major problems still remain, right? Like the fate of hostages. the role of Hamas in Gaza thereafter. So I said, watching those comments very carefully, it's the open question here as we're discussing with each other. I don't think anyone who knows, anyone who's sort of rushed to the idea it means end of, abrupt end of this chapter, I think is probably misbegotten.
You've mentioned Brexit a couple of times, and at the time, obviously, we Brexiteers, that is, did talk about the concept of global Britain. Has Brexit damaged Britain internationally?
No, but it was tricky to deal with. So you say we Brexiteers. I've always kept my cards
No,
very
no, no.
close to myself.
I didn't mean you. I didn't mean you. Therefore, I'm sorry. I meant.
I've been described as Bregsnostic, which I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure that's
I
a
meant
possible position.
myself as personifying the nation, and also obviously your ex-boss. In fact, all first three of your prime ministerial ex-bosses were supportive of Brexit.
So there's nothing inevitable about anything in international affairs, and there's nothing inevitable about the fact that Brexit means X or Y. I think that's important, and I've seen the way and how quickly things can change when different types of challenges come along. For example, on Ukraine, so you had sort of. I'll come back to that in a moment. I did hear, I think it was Alex Younger, former head of SIS, that said the other day, is Brexit undoubtedly has damaged, Britain's standing in the world. And, having been through some of those issues while doing the foreign policy, I've also involved in some of the elements of Brexit talks. Was it really fraught and difficult? And did it cause a lot of sand in the gears of pretty critical relationships ultimately, e.g. with the French or in Brussels? Yeah, unquestionably, it was very, very difficult to navigate over a period of time. But again, you and I are historians, Andrew, whatever we are, and anything else, and that's kind of a fact of life that partnerships, rise and fall in fortune, and certainly in the sort of back end of my involvement in government, we'd actually reset a lot of those relationships as well. But then the kind of proof of the pudding's in the eating, right? So, I'm very cautious not to sort of overstate the UK role on Ukraine, and I was cautious in my response to you. But that having been said, I think the broader Western collective response, which I lionized and said had been really quite effective, even if I have criticisms here or there, and I'd like to see it be stronger and firmer still, would not have been possible if it wasn't for this unique fact of actually Brexit Britain, boorish Brexit Britain becoming momentarily, in some people's eyes, that this odd creature of the kind of moral conscience of Europe on this subject. So these European dynamics are quite significant. And then also, if you look at the sort of decisions that we're involved in, if you're say an American, what we're here in California with a lot of senior national security figures. If you're an American, you're looking over the course of this administration. So let's say you had a not favorable view of Brexit at the start of the Biden administration. If you look by the end of it, you look around the world, and you look at your allies and partners, you see in the UK, a country that is increasing in its investment in defence, that when the proverbial hits the fan in certain places is there and very active. Take the Ukraine portfolio. There's a huge debate on Ukraine policy in the US, particularly Ukraine portfolio. Take the UK's involvement in the defence of Israel on the first wave of the Iranian attacks and secondarily involvement thereafter. Take the fact that it's only the US and the UK, with a couple of other nations providing logistical support, who were kinetically involved in responding to attacks by the Houthis as well. You'd see a pretty activist, and also a country deepening ties in terms of AUKUS, etc., and is aligned with you, willing to take pain on economic security. You'd look around and say, well, is that a diminished position, or is that by the end of a US administration, you look around and it's the sort of the Brits involved. So from that perspective, significant.
Would we have been first in Europe with the COVID vaccine if we'd been in the EU?
You may know, but this is not my forte. But unquestionably, in the period of government, the what we did with the COVID vaccine is a UK success. Who knows if we'd had a UK success as part of a European project? You might have been in the front and changed the dynamics. It's a counterfactual which we've not yet played with. But unquestionably, you cannot doubt that's a significant success of the government, the vaccine rollout. Challenging as hell as COVID public policy was.
One of the reasons that the UK is able to speak with a voice that others will listen to is that we are still a united kingdom. Um, you're obviously from Ulster. How is the union with Northern Ireland? Do you think in 50 years' time the six counties will be united with the Southern 26?
Yeah, yeah, I do. And among the other things I've written about my other books, actually, Andrew, the fourth and the fifth, which aren't B-sides to yours, have been about the Union in different forms and challenging in periods in Irish and Northern Irish history. And that's given me the great pleasure of watching these sort of periodic academic intellectual class predictions of the decline of the Union, right, both in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And if you take the Union, here's a good factoid. This is Robertsian in its spirit. It's a bit of Robertsian arithmetic. If you add up the United States of America and the European Union as two sort of entities, different forms of federal entity, if you like, they've lasted less long than the United Kingdom and its entity. So it's a pretty enduring form of state by any European Western international standards, and it's enduring because it's has built into it a Burkean ability to evolve over that period of time. So and you read these things like Tom Nairn's 1977 book, The Breakup of Britain. If you think about that difficult post-Brexit period and the sort of surge of Scottish nationalism, if you think about the challenge of dealing with the Northern Ireland question, more recently, that's the sort of fundamentals of the Union, both in terms of levels of democratic support for it, and also just the sort of fundamental facts. I once helped Boris Johnson write a piece in the Belfast Telegraph in which we described the cranes of Holland and Wolff as sort of the gleaming steel facts of the Union. Holland and Wolff is not doing so well now.
I was about to say it's a slightly iffy fact, right
but it's been an iffy fact for a period of time, and the government comes in. But basically, I'm a believer in the stability of the Union, right? But the Union's got to keep on adapting, responding to these sort of this undulating change. But yeah, there's a logic to the Union that gives it a considerable degree of resilience. No one thought the Northern Irish state, which recently celebrated its centenary, would last that long. And my God, it's the people in charge of it have done their best to screw it up in many periods of time. So yeah, I'm a really quite confident believer in the strength of the Union, but not a complacent one.
Any more books in the pipeline?
I have a book that I was contracted to write before I went into government with our shared editor, Stuart Prophet. So I was working on that before I went into government. I was having a great time doing it before I got the tap on the shoulder. And it was a book on the kind of rise and fall of Western world order. But I've just spent the last 45 minutes telling you that Western world order is in rude health. So I have to go back to the archives and adapt that. But that's the book for which I'm contracted. I'm looking forward to getting back to.
Did you keep a diary when you were in Number 10?
You always ask me this, Andrew. So I didn't keep a diary. And the people who kept diaries scribbling in the corner are always regarded with immense suspicion. But I did because I had your sort of the enforced guilt that you gave me when I went in about this on the back of my mind. So I talked to HR McMaster yesterday about this in the sense that what you do keep is your scheduler, and you keep your sort of things to do list for the day. And actually, it's remarkable how much how much you remember. But the trick is, I think, is before it all gets addled away and eaten away by a return to academic life, is to probably sit down and just transcribe those thoughts a bit more.
You've got
great
to do
anecdotes,
it,
great stories.
You've got to do it immediately.
Yeah,
you absolutely have to do it immediately.
Let's do it when we get off this podcast.
Put your book on hold and do this. Now, talking about books, what history book or biography are you reading at the moment?
So the biography that I picked up again, and I very much admire, is actually Fred Logevall's book on JFK.
Yeah.
But the last book I was reading, and this sounds remarkably pompous, but I'm going to do it anyway. My most recent trip to Ukraine, I reread The Prince by Machiavelli on the way back. And my God, every time you read it, the sort of relevance to the types of things that we're interested in statecraft, it really sort of hits you in the face. And particularly the foreword, in which he says, in this sort of crouching position before the prince, "I can't give you many gifts, my dear sir, but I can give you the gift of my years of learning and wisdom and historical research in a very potted form, and I can hand it over to you. That's a genius sort of position for the advisor to take.
They were your first words as you entered Number 10 to Boris, weren't they?
Actually, my first words were you wrote a piece in the Telegraph in which you celebrated the wisdom of Boris Johnson for bringing in a fine young historian. I was young then, and Boris Johnson, of course, was an avid reader of the Daily Telegraph, for which he used to write, and walked past with a copy under his arm and said, Professor. Our good friend Andrew Roberts has just been very nice about you. So that's my first memory in Number 10. I think I did write down that, but I found that so amusing.
That's how you've got to start your diaries. Tell me, what's your favourite counterfactual, your what if?
So I thought about this a little bit, and I heard you discuss sort of global affairs in this yesterday, but I'm going to go for one that's going to reflects the juncture between our two different bits of writing, and it's an Irish one, and it relates to your hero George III. Can I describe him as your hero?
Yeah,
okay.
Undoubtedly.
Your hero George III, and my hero Lord Castlereagh. Lord Castlereagh, born in 1769, 6 weeks apart from our other heroes, Wellington and Napoleon. In that head, what was in the water that summer?
Amazing, and I think Ney as well,
okay.
maybe Soult.
Okay, it was a happy the summer of '69 as they think about it. So Castlereagh has just put down the rebellion in Ireland, including in very dramatic scenes. I say this if any screenwriters are listening. It's a remarkable story, locking up people that voted for him and his father in their local constituency, that were fellow supporters of the American Revolution and the volunteer movement. But he's been part of the suppression of the Irish rebellion, and he's part of the abolition of the Irish Parliament, which is a kind of great crime against historic nationalism. But actually, the whole point about the Irish Parliament that Castlereagh is trying to abolish, because Ireland is unruly, Ireland is a weakness to the British state, Ireland is the Achilles heel because the French at any stage can land on it, even in their revolutionary form and encourage a revolution, or even in the Napoleonic form and encourage a kind of anti-British movement to kind of force out British control of Ireland. So Castlereagh says there's a problem. And the problem is actually partially the Irish landed parliament. And he wants to get rid of the Irish landed parliament because a third of the British army in this period of time is Catholic Irish over this period of time. And the reason his argument for the Union in getting rid of the Irish parliament is that this is the best means to deliver Catholic emancipation, full voting rights for Catholics in Ireland. So basically he sees this as a marriage of heart and head between England and Ireland to allow for a greater plurality of religions and views. So if you have Catholic emancipation on its own in Ireland, it's too revolutionary because the landed aristocracy are completely knocked out. Then Catholicism becomes the religion of the state. But if you do it in the United Kingdom, you can have tolerance and liberty, and he's doing it for security reasons. He's a hawk. He's worried about European politics. He thinks Ireland's vulnerable. Andrew, who stops him?
George III stops him because he reckons that it is completely contrary to the coronation oath. And if you read the coronation oath, he is right. But I can't believe that they weren't able to alter the coronation oath, that somehow the Parliament couldn't have retrospectively changed the coronation oath. But George III was a tremendous stickler for things like oaths and promises, essentially this promise both to God and to the people. And so he wasn't going to allow that.
So what happens thereafter is that Catholic emancipation eventually comes by 1829. So Castlereagh fails to deliver his part of the promise, this great reconciliation.
He's committed suicide by then.
He's committed suicide by then.
But you've got a new king who does pass it.
And Wellington is the prime minister at that crucial moment in time after with great reluctance. So it's done grudgingly and at force and after a mass mobilisation of Catholic nationalist Ireland. And you have a unity that used to be, the Presbyterians used to be the radical anti-British force in the 1790s. And then you have this sense of Irish Catholic nationalism. So these great Anglo-Irish writers thereafter describe the Union as something that in Castlereagh's head was supposed to be heart and head, but because of George III, ended up becoming sort of an unpleasant forced marriage in which was never truly consummated. And I guess my what if is whether or not that the Union had been accompanied by Catholic emancipation, would the history of Ireland and Britain in the 19th and 20th century have been a happier one?
I think undoubtedly it would have been. Yeah. John Bew, the foreign policy advisor for 4 prime ministers, who's now thinking deeply about urgent security choices here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Thank you very much for coming on Secrets of Statecraft.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, John. My next guest on Secrets of Statecraft will be Radek Sikorski, the Foreign Minister of Poland.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.